So the project itself, what were we trying to do? We were asked to do this back in late 2009 by the board, and the board was pretty clear. They're not looking at tweaking the old regulatory framework. They wanted a new regulatory framework. And so that's been our challenge, is to look at the framework that currently exists, which I think by most accounts we have had. And the more work we do with other jurisdictions, the more we're hearing that we've probably got, if not the best, we're in the top 2 or 3 best regulators for understanding this stuff in the world. So we want to be careful not to turf out all the good stuff that we've been developing for 75 years and come up with something that may create more problems than we fix. So that's been the challenge, is how do we do that? And it started off, our goal then, without reading all this, is to come up with something that is as effective as we've had, but more efficient. And part of that goes to the scope and scale. A lot of the risks that we've seen are no different in the new world as they were in the old. It's just there's a lot more of it. So to be efficient, how do we manage all that extra work? So it applies to all these things are to be considered to be conventional, CBM, tight oil, shale gas, and shale oil. We're not defining what unconventional is. It's a moving target. And at one time, oil sands was considered to be unconventional, but most people don't think of it that way anymore. We always get asked, how come you're not including oil sands? And we aren't, because there's another strategy, another board strategic objective that's focused on oil sands. Now, the one thing we are doing, and we've got Kim in the room here, Kim has been working with the oil sands, mapping their processes and helping them move forward. And she's also now working on our stuff too. And we've talked a lot with the oil sands folks. What we don't want to have happen is 2 completely different regulatory regimes coming out of this building that look like one was done in Nigeria and one in Quebec or something. We want them to look like Ercb products. But there are differences, and we want to respect the differences between the way you develop oil sands and how you develop some of this other stuff. So that when we started the project, the first thing we did is looked at what are the risks of unconventional development, and primarily with shale gas, and are they different than conventional? So we started by looking at other jurisdictions to try to understand what was going on. There was a lot of shale gas development in the United States. That's really where it started, in the Barnett Shale in Texas. BC was ahead of us because they were developing shale gas. And to this day, we don't have much shale gas development in this province. I think there's about a total of something like 250 wells, and a dozen of those are horizontal wells. And the reason is because gas is just too cheap, and nobody's going to spend that kind of money on those kind of wells. So where the development is going is into natural gas liquids, because lots of money will be made there, and looking at our conventional oil reservoirs. And that's why the activity in Alberta is focused on those. We'll likely get to shale gas when the prices go up, and whether that's, depending on who you want to listen to, could be 2 or 3 years, or it could be 2 or 3 decades. There's a lot of variables on that one. But it doesn't really matter. The activity is here now. It's using that technology. There are some subtle differences, and we can talk a bit about those. So the first step was looking at the risk. What are the risks? And we did it through our own work, plus surveying other jurisdictions. And then once we understood what those risks are, then we looked at what do we want to achieve. So if we want to mitigate, what are these risks do we need to mitigate? And which ones are we willing just to accept the way they are? So what outcomes do we want? And that we thought would be pretty straightforward, and I don't think we've still got that one quite right. And then the framework design, we've come up with that, and those 2 pieces are complete. And then the third piece is implementing, and we'll hopefully, that would have been most of this talk, but there's some of this upfront stuff I think we need to make sure we understood. So I'll go through these, and I think some of the folks in this room have seen these slides before, so kind of a little bit old news. So I'll go through them quickly for those that haven't, and make sure you've got a chance to ask questions. So first step was looking at what are the risks, and we ended up with initially 3 broad buckets of risks that you had to think about that were at a scale that was different than conventional. And the first one is around water management and protection. We'll talk a little bit more what that is. The second one we had called hydraulic fracturing, and all the stuff that's associated with the things that can go wrong with hydraulic fracturing. We've since changed that to containment, which means making sure that everything that goes down a wellbore or comes back up a wellbore stays within the wellbore, and anything injected into a formation stays within that target formation. That's the goal. So what could cause that to go wrong on us? And then the third is a big one, and that's the impact on the landscape. So what is the cumulative impact of this kind of development? And then finally, one that we added at the end was the whole question around communication. And that's both from an internal point of view, making sure people understand, but certainly on the external side, things like hydraulic fracturing have gotten into the media, they've gotten into the public's mind, and it's taken off. And I think that's one area, had we been able to roll back the bus a little bit on this, we would have addressed some of the communication piece a lot better than we would. Lots of information out there, lots of access now with social media, but a lot of it's not very good information. There's a lot of misunderstood stuff going on. The other thing on this slide to point out, I'm not sure if I have another one similar, so I'll just check. Nope. So I'll point it out now. One of the other questions that comes back at us all the time is the concern about contamination of groundwater because of the depth that this activity is occurring. So the point of this slide is a typical water well, and this is roughly to scale. Unfortunately, with the lighting and the size of the thing, you don't really get a sense of it. But a typical water well in Alberta is drilled to less than 50 meters. And there's a few that may make it as much as 100 meters. So it's very shallow. Our depth of groundwater protection, and there's a little wiggly line on here that demonstrates that, is about, it's at what's is considered to be 4,000 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids. And that runs in the range of, I think, somewhere around 150 meters roughly to 650 meters. But well below where potable water is typically drawn, and at salinities well below what you would typically drink. So that's what's protected. Now, as you keep on going deeper, you're going to encounter water, but it becomes saltier and saltier until you get down to formations we typically produce oil and gas from, and the salinity of the water is greater than seawater, many times greater, and some depending on how deep you go. So as a rule of thumb, deeper you go, saltier the water, and the less usable it becomes. And the depths that we're looking at for this type of development, horizontal wells, multi-stage fracking, is in Alberta right now, it's about 650 to somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 meters. And the shallower ones, from 650 to 2,500, are on our typical oil pools, and they're not using the really big fracks. So the kinds of hydraulic fracking you hear about in the Barnett Shale or in the Horn River Basin in BC are in shales, and they're big slick water fracks. And we don't have much of that kind of activity in the province, and where we do, it's going to be deeper. It's in things like the Montney Formation and the Duvernay, and the Duvernay's the sweet spot is about 3,000 meters. So it gives you a sense of how deep this is below our groundwater. So we don't have to worry necessarily about direct communication coming up for a variety of reasons. And I could spend, this is a fun slide, I could spend an hour on it, but I'll move it along. So on the water side, the issues that come up, clearly the water volumes that are being used. And if you look at Pennsylvania and Horn River, they can be into is something like 80,000 cubic meters per well. So in the worst case scenario, it's like taking 36 Olympic-sized swimming pools and sending it down the wellbore. We're not seeing those size of fracs in Alberta, mainly because of the target zones. You can use anywhere from 0, if it's something like a propane frac, up to, we're hearing 4,000 to 5,000 cubes. But if we move into some of these big resource plays, and similar to that diagram I showed, when you're in the Duvernay or the Montney, then we can potentially see some very large volumes. And whether they're large or not, it's the number of wells that are necessary to drill these things too becomes pretty big. So if you start multiplying it up, you're getting into big volumes. So that's an issue with the public. It's an issue no matter what the size is. As a rule, nobody wants to see good potable water going down one of these wellbores, being contaminated and being brought back to surface. So that's an issue. The other is the potential to contaminate groundwater. And there's sort of three ways that potentially could happen. 2 have happened in other jurisdictions. And one was related to this casing and cement. So no cement in the wellbore, improper cementing, and methane migrates into the wellbore up and into an aquifer. And that's been documented in Pennsylvania and is shown in, I think it was Ohio, where it blew a house up. So the water well in the house, and boom. And by the way, I don't think in Alberta you're allowed to put your water well in your house anymore. It has to be outside. And partially for the reason is that methane exists in Alberta at virtually from right at the base of your feet all the way down. So it's there no matter what in all strata, at just at different concentrations, and it's there in your normal drinking water. So you get too much of a buildup and you hit an explosive limit, and you've got a bit of a problem. So that's the one way, and it's been documented. The other way is how you handle the flowback fluids when it comes to surface. So you're flowing back used hydraulic frac fluid water plus whatever else comes out of that formation, and how you store it on site. and what you do to dispose it. In Pennsylvania, they did have issues with, they were allowing that fluid to be sent to municipal waste treatment plants or sewage treatment plants, which are not designed to handle it. And the best they can do is do some dilution, dump it into the local river system. And that's something we've never allowed here in Alberta, but that's what was happening in Pennsylvania and led to contamination of groundwater. And they had issues with leaking pits and overflow and things like that. So again, not handled well at surface for whatever reason, either because the requirements aren't strong enough or industry's not following those requirements, and you've got some problems. The third way is what typically we hear from the concern from media or public is you create this fracture that goes all the way up into your groundwater. And to this point, there's not been a documented case anywhere that we can find in the world where that's actually occurred. And from a pure geology perspective, and those with a geology background, in order the ability to do that is extremely, extremely remote. It would require an incredible amount of pressure, and that pressure tends to dissipate. The other thing is that you try to keep your fractures within the target zone that you're after for a variety of reasons, and some of it's economics. There's no point in putting in more than you need. The other is if you contact other rock above or below, it may be salt water bearing, or it may have sour gas, or who knows what, and you don't want to be producing that. Not only that, you may not even own the rights to it. So typically you try to construct your fractures so that they'll only cover the target zone, and there's many, many zones above them. So in Alberta, what we're hearing is vertical fractures may go anywhere from 0 to 30 meters in height typically, and horizontally from 10 or 20 to maybe 100 meters horizontally from the wellbore. They're bigger in BC because you're deeper, it's more brittle rock, and the formations that they're after are much thicker, so they're putting in bigger fracs. So just some examples of some of the way water and flowback fluid are contained on site. A bunch of barrels is one, in a pit is another. We don't see much of this in Alberta. Most of it's in barrels. And then the third are some things called sea rings, and they're temporary rings that are used both for the fresh water going in and then flowback fluid coming out. From there it's treated, reused as much as they can, and then disposed of. So the other issue was the fractures themselves, what we're calling containment now, but it was a hydraulic fracking piece, and our concerns around that. Most of this is technical operations issues, so we want to make sure that we understand how far that fracture propagates out, both vertically and horizontally, for a variety of reasons. One is we want to understand how much of that resource we can recover, and you can only produce what you can frack. So if you don't know how big the fractures are going, you really can't figure out how much you're going to ultimately get out of the ground. The other is there may be offset wells, and some of you probably are aware that we've had cases in Alberta now where a fracture's gone out, contacted a producing well, and caused problems for the producing well, which can range everywhere from a pressure pulse to blowing stuff out at the surface onto fortunately most of it just onto the lease. So that's an issue. But we're also concerned about if there's an old abandoned well within that fracture propagation, what could happen to that, and could it be a conduit for contamination uphole? So there's some things like that we're working on. There's also been the concern raised about the ability to induce earthquakes, if that's real or not, so very low risk. I talked about the scale of these. I won't go into it anymore, other than lots of folks ask, well, how long are the horizontal sections? Most are in the neighborhood of 12 to 1,600, but we do have companies looking at 2,000. And we've also got a couple of companies saying that they're trying to get out, they can drill out to 3,000 meters relatively easily. The issue is trying to get effective fracs out that far. So the long ones are in the neighborhood of about 2,000 meters horizontal. So again, that's a technology, that's a positive thing. The longer you can get those, then the fewer wells you need to put on the landscape. And so in the perfect world, if you could get 10 kilometers underground with each wellbore, that's a lot less on the landscape. So it's a piece of changing technology on the positive side. This one ends up being probably the biggest issue once the operation is up and running and the water issues are dealt with, and it's really boils down to the amount of truck traffic. And it can be literally thousands of wells or trucks per well. So if you've got a pad with 8 wells on it, and it takes a few weeks to drill a well, then a few weeks to days usually to hydraulically frack the well, and you repeat the process with anywhere from 4 to 16 wells, that strings out over a very long time period, and you can look at thousands of wells or trucks per well. So a road that's designed for a car to go down it every half hour, that's seeing lineups It has a huge impact on the roads, has a huge impact from a public safety perspective. And in jurisdictions we've talked to, we went down, looked at North Dakota, that's developing a shale oil play called the Bakken. This ends up being their biggest issue. And anecdotally, they told of an intersection with a stop sign that nobody ever stopped for the stop sign because you never saw another car. And now there are times they'd say you could sit there for 25 minutes waiting to get through that stop sign. There's so many trucks. So that becomes a huge issue, and it destroys the roads that weren't designed for that kind of truck traffic. And then there's dust and emissions and all those other good things that go with it. So just a sense of the footprint. Typical CBM well, it's not a big, if that's across the road from you, probably is not a big deal. This is a pad in BC in the Horn River, 12 wells on it. And Canada said this one would operate probably for 3 years like this before they would start to wind down and you just have the wellhead. So if that's across the road from you versus that one, it's a bit of a different scenario when you're dealing with the noise and the light and the dust coming from that. So we need to look at that differently than we've traditionally looked at it. This is a shale gas one, so we're not doing this here, but this is really no different here for an oil play. It looks very much similar number of tanks and fairly close to that same number of trucks. So, and that's one well and one pad, so if you've got a pad site with 8 wells, well, you got to go through that process 8 times before you're done. And out by Crossfield, just a regular vertical well, and this is a 3-well pad. There's room on this pad for probably a couple other wells, so a little more land taken out of production. So that's the risk side of it. And we wanted to go through that first, because if we don't think the risk is any different than what we're seeing today, then you have to question why are we even bothering making any change. But clearly we saw some big differences there, and it fell into those 3 categories. So a whole bunch of outcomes related to all the stuff that are in our mandate. So we've got outcomes related to public safety, environment protection, conservation, and so on, related to the risks that we had come up with. And I won't go through them all, but just to give you an example, things like sustainable levels of water use. Now, they're pretty high level at this point, but our goal is once we are looking at requirements for a particular play, we'll look at which ones of these we need to go down to the next level. And that work will depend is on a play-based approach, which I'll talk about here in a bit. So a bunch more. I won't go through them all. Phase 2 is the concept, and I'll go through this fairly quickly. After we looked through the risks, we ended up coming to the conclusion that we wanted a risk-based approach. And what that really means is that as one of the other strategic objectives that you're probably aware of, the board has asked for an integrated risk management plan. So it's a management plan on how we manage risks through the whole organization. Both risks that are internal risks, such as our IT systems going down, or external focus risks, so a blowout of a sour gas well. How do we manage those things? Which means understanding the risks, understanding new risks, all that stuff. But it also means that, and the piece we're looking at here is that if we're taking a risk-based approach, we look at the level of risk and we look at the level of oversight that should be applied. So if the risk is low, we probably don't need much for oversight, and maybe none. And in some cases, we can probably remove regulations. If it's a high-risk scenario, then we may look at increased regulatory oversight. So that's really, it's as simple as that. Now, as we know, risk itself is a much more complicated question, so there's a lot going right into this piece to fully understand how we deal with this. But there's a whole other strategy looking at that, fortunately. The other is, once we have identified risks, then how do you make sense of those? So how do you apply regulations to a random bunch of risks? So what we're trying to do is figure out a logical way of grouping risks. And the way we came up with is you do it by play. And I'll explain a little in a second what a play is, but really what it does is allow you to group a set of risks into one and then apply your regulatory oversight onto that grouping. So it'll make more sense in a couple slides. So, and what that grouping looks like is it's based on certain things. So what creates the risk in the first place? Or it's created by the activity, so drilling into something, and the type of technology will create the risk. But the level of risk depends on the profile, which includes geology. So every different rock formation is going to be different depending on things like depth, the pressure that it's under, the porosity, permeability, all of those things will lead into it. The geographic area. So I'll give an example. If you were drilling coal bed methane in central Alberta, if you look at the geology, it's a bunch of very thin zones, and they're fairly shallow, so the pressure is low, which means the gas pressure coming out is very low. So from a public safety point, and it's sweet gas, so from a public safety point of view, risk is pretty low. If you're looking at a sour gas well in the foothills, it's deep, under a lot of pressure, it's sour, so the public safety risk is high. And it depends on whether you're in an area with lots of people or no people. So all those, we look at those from a play and define a play, and then based on those criteria, and that helps us determine what the risk profile of a play is. So a Duvernay play that takes an awful lot of water may have high risk from an environmental standpoint. We're using a lot of water, lots of footprint on the landscape, but a sweet gas play in southern Alberta probably has a low environmental impact and a low public safety impact. So how much risk or how much regulatory oversight we put on those, it shouldn't be one size fits all. It doesn't make sense for us to apply equal amount of regulation on a sweet gas play that's shallow as it does to a play that's got a lot of risk associated with it. So that's really what it took us months to come to that, and I'm going to explain it to you in a minute and a half is what that all means. So if you've got it, you've done better than me. So what does it mean for moving forward? The other piece that we've talked about is we're going to apply our regulatory regime to plays. But the starting point will be with our existing regulations. So that's the piece when we started to talk to industry a little bit about this. They were a little concerned that there's two rule books depending on whether it was unconventional or conventional, and we said no, there's not going to be two. There's also concern that we're chucking out all the 75 years of history of rules and regulations and replacing them. But what we are doing is saying you start off with the existing rules and requirements that are out there, and once we declare a play and you're developing your activities within the play, there will be some changes to some of those rules. Some of them will disappear and some will add on depending on the risk of that play. So if we've got a bunch of rules that are related to things that are really not a risk in that play, we may get rid of those rules. If we've got areas that we need to enhance, such as because we're going to have a huge footprint, we may be adding in rules.